Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan. Today I'm going to talk about the comments that Jordan Peterson made on Islam, him not being able to understand two fundamental uh, differences that Islam has with Christianity and how he perceives Islam to be incompatible with Western civilization or and secularism, and it's something that he finds difficult to comprehend and understand. And then at the end, he said he hopes he's wrong. So I'm going to play his video first, and then we're going to sort of pause it and interject briefly and discuss it. Okay, let's just get rid of the
Some
ad
of the
first.
most interesting businesses started with go they did this small. She said,
Okay.
there's a couple of things that I can't wrap my head around easily in relationship to Islam. And so one is what I see as the failure to separate church from state. And that's a problem. Now, it may not be a problem as such, but it's certainly a problem in relationship to the relation between Islam and the West because we separate church from state. Now, there's fundamentalists in the United States, Christian fundamentalists, who think that that separation is a mistake. So it's not only an idea that's rooted in Islam that those should be united, but it's definitely a problem with regards to our coexistence because that's a fundamentally different presumption. Okay, so
So he says that it's definitely a problem with regards to our coexistence, meaning the coexistence between Muslims and the West. Now, this is a very problematic supposition or presumption because if not coexistence, then what? I mean, that is a big problem. 1.9 billion people in the world self identify as Muslims. So if you're saying the problem is fundamentally this, and therefore Islam cannot coexist with the West, then what? Exterminate 1.9 billion people who are self identify as Muslims, or convert them all to Christianity? What then? So that's first of all the problem with what Dr. Peterson is saying. But be that as it may, forget about that bit. Forget about what that would mean in terms of how that would play out, and let's look at this issue about the separation of church and state more deeply. Um, by the way, the separation of church and state in Christendom uh, hasn't happened that long ago in history. So, for the vast majority of Christendom, Christianity was co opted by the Roman Empire and ruled as a Christian state. And it's very recent in modern history that there was the separation of church and state in Christendom. Jordan Peterson also says in some of his other lectures, and let me just say that I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. I watch a lot of his content on YouTube. I've read his book, 12 Rules for Life. I've benefited from it. Um, I have certain issues with it, but I've benefited from it nevertheless. And I found that much of what Jordan Peterson talks about is very consistent with Islam, if not, in fact, very Islamic, ironically. Um, and it's also quite ironic that Jordan Peterson, who's pretty much an icon of mine, is also uh, doesn't really know how to negotiate Islam, and in fact, this position he takes seems to be a bit uh, clash of civilizations type of thing. You know, it is very warlike. If, in fact, I think, as a Muslim, and so myself being a Muslim, a person who has studied Islam also extensively, um, I think I need to shed some light on this issue of church and state in Islam. Now, when the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be on him, emerged on the scene in Arabia, he preached a message very similar to what was taught before him by other prophets, namely that there is only one God, monotheism, and that because there is only one God, all people are equal, essentially, equal before this God, and all people have equal access to this God. And so, all people, regardless of religion, regardless of caste, regardless of tribe, should be treated with dignity and respect, and should be honored, and um, should have rights under God. And so it is not surprising that Islam became, Muslims launched themselves into the world after the death of the Prophet Muhammad and became a world empire, because something fundamentally in Islam was and had a very civilizing effect on the Arabs, as it were. And so, church and state in Islam were not separated because the civilizing effect of the religion gave birth to the state. Again, the civilizing effect of the religion gave birth to the state. But the church and state are not the same thing. Just because one thing gave birth to another doesn't mean that it is fundamentally part of what the religion is. Similarly, Jordan Peterson, in some of his lectures, acknowledges and says that Western civilization is premised on the Judeo Christian tradition. Now, if it is premised on the Judeo Christian tradition, then we could say that the Judeo Christian tradition birthed the Western civilization. Yet, we don't say that the Western civilization is being governed by the church or by the Old Testament, by Judaism or Christianity. And so there's a difference between those two things. And as far as Islam goes, the state was incidental to the civilizing effect that Islam had on the Arabs. The regiment of praying 5 times a day, of getting up in the morning, of being disciplined, of working hard, and of being able to work together as a unit, because Islam encouraged brotherhood and companionship and caring for your brother, wanting for your brother what you want for yourself, etc. Those values forged a community that could become a world empire later on. And that's what, I mean, amongst other very practical things also. The standard of cleanliness that Islam encouraged, for example, was unheard of at that time in the world.
So that's problem number one. Problem number two, for me, and again, this may be a consequence of my ignorance, which I'm trying to rectify. Muhammad was a warlord, and I don't know what to do about that fact. Like, one thing you can say about Christ, hypothetically, let's say, I'm not talking about a historical reality necessarily, although I'm not denying it either, is that of all the things he was, warlord was definitely not one of them.
Let's stop there, okay? This is also to completely ignore the context in which Christ lived and the context in which Muhammad lived, which were two very different contexts, okay? So you cannot take two people who lived in two totally different epochs in history and then compare them in this way, just along these particular lines. Christ did not face the same challenges that Muhammad faced. And Christ, and the modern version of Christ, essentially what we see Christ as now, and how Christ, Jesus, really was, is also two different things. I mean, that is glaringly obvious too. So the Christianity that does not have teeth, the Christianity that does not stand up for itself, that was not the Christianity of Christ at all. And so this sort of peace, no war doctrine, that was not how early Christians thankfully, that's not how they rolled, and that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Um, about Muhammad being a warlord, we need to understand that Muhammad preached Islam peacefully for 13 years in Mecca and faced several death threats. When finally he migrated with his community to another place so he could live in peace with his community, it didn't end there. They relentlessly pursued him with armies, and he had to constantly defend himself and his little community. In a tribal society, Muhammad was a definite danger and threat because tribes were built on the basis of family alliances and blood, whereas Muhammad was building a tribe in the way that they might have perceived it, based on faith, and he was absorbing members of each tribe into his tribe, so to say, because that was the only construct they had to conceive of what he was doing. And this was obviously a danger and undermining the power of the various warlords in Arabia. And so to say that Muhammad was a warlord, and that is difficult to conceive of, the point is, in the history, in the time period, in 7th century Arabia, any man proclaiming to worship one God and building a community would not have survived if he did not organize himself militarily and defend his community. And doing that was not in any way motivated by political dominance. And that is glaringly obvious too in Islamic history.
And I don't know what to do about that. And so I don't know how to reconcile that. And I don't know how to reconcile, like, not only was Muhammad a warlord, which I don't think is an unreasonable thing to proclaim, the expansion that he initiated was unbelievably successful. I mean, within 600 years, it was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And it demolished Byzantine Christianity.
Right, Jordan Peterson, it was not unbelievably successful, it was quite believably successful because Islam brought something to the world that the world had lost, the world didn't have. And Byzantine Christianity was not Christianity as Jesus had brought it. So it was two entirely different things. In some ways, you could say that the Muslims were more Christian than the Christians were at that time. So it was not in reality so unbelievable. Actually, it was very believable and realistic and inevitable, in fact, that the Muslims would become a global power because they had something that no one else had, and that was Islam. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that the story of empires right through history is that when an empire starts, a budding empire, a budding power starts to form somewhere in the world, the other empires, the existing empires around it, would view it as a threat, an immediate threat, and try to undermine it. And so the conquests of early Muslims were actually in the spirit of surviving because they were becoming a threat and they were becoming a world power, and that would mean the rest of the empires around them would feel threatened and undermined and want to move in on them. And so what they did was the logical and thing to do, which is strike first. And that's what they did. And that is the story of empires the world over. It is not so hard to believe. Any budding power, if you look at the geopolitical situation now, you will see that there's a balance of power in the world between global powers, and that there is a constant attempt of global powers to undermine each other, and they try to maintain this delicate balance of power so as not to go to war. In the time of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire that coexisted with the Islamic Empire, there was not going to be a happy coexistence. And the Muslims did the only thing that made sense, which was to conquer the neighboring empires. But in so doing, and it is totally untrue that they demolished Christianity, because had the Muslims wanted to demolish Christianity, there would not be a single Christian left, and that's the truth, because that's how powerful they were. So they did not attempt at all to demolish Christianity. And if you look at Muslim uh, governance in the Islamic empires that existed, there was a very tolerant stance towards Christendom and towards Judaism. And that is because the scripture they follow views these people as being fellow monotheists and people of the book. And so there was actually no demonization of these religions. Yes, Islam has had in its history a problem with polytheists because it has viewed polytheism as the arch enemy of Islam. And in mentioning things like, for example, the Taliban, whom we all acknowledge to be extremists, have, for example, destroyed the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan. It's worth noting that Afghanistan has been ruled by Muslims for centuries. Okay, if not more than 1,000 years, the Muslims have ruled Afghanistan, and not once did they attempt to destroy the Buddhist statues and temples and things like that. So, if now in this latest event that they finally, some extremist Muslims, the Taliban, have done something like that, you can see that it is very much a new narrative within Islam and has nothing to do with when Muslims were a global superpower.
which is something that Western people don't even know. I've read thinkers who said that the West was so traumatized culturally, let's say, by the demolition of Byzantine Christianity that we can't even study it now. And so, I don't know if that's true, but I don't know that it's not true either. And the Buddhists were wiped out of Afghanistan, and we saw that echoed in the Taliban's destruction of those great Buddhist monuments. And so what I'm hoping is that there's a bridge. There better be a bridge.
The ironic thing, Jordan Peterson, is that there is a bridge, and in fact, there has always been a bridge, because Western civilization really and truly came out of the Dark Ages through scholarship of Westerners that took place in Arabic in the Islamic world. And so, in a way, Western civilization has a lot to thank. Western civilization is indebted to the Islamic civilization of the past for having arrived at where they are now. Okay, back in the Dark Ages, when Europeans were stuffing the wombs of women who had given birth with ash, Muslims already had midwives treating pregnant women. So the fact of the matter is, a lot of what later became the Renaissance in Western civilization came from scholarship and scholars who had studied in the Islamic world, because the language of education at that time was Arabic, philosophy was taught in Arabic, medicine was taught in Arabic, and everything that related to civilization was actually through the bridge of Islam. And so that bridge always existed, and so there is no such thing really as a clash of civilizations. In fact, Western civilization is very much it's actually, a lot of Western civilization is actually very Islamic, incidentally.
And that's why I want to have these discussions, because I'd like to understand if there's a bridge. And so lots of people have sent me people who I should talk to, who they think represent Islam far better than I am personally. And perhaps they're correct. And hopefully I'll get an opportunity to talk to them, because I would like to know why. I would like to know if what I think is wrong. Because if it's wrong, it's important that I know it's wrong. But at the moment, I don't know it's wrong, and B, I'm not sure what it signifies.
Right, this is a dangerous narrative that I think Jordan Peterson is pursuing, although he's not pursuing it admittedly. He's saying he hopes he's wrong and he's not sure what it means. It's very evident what it means. If you take a stance and say that Islam is incompatible with Western civilization, what it means is that Islam and Western civilization have to go to war and annihilate each other. That's what it means, because these civilizations are incompatible, which is simply not true. It's simply false. It is a false narrative. There is no clash of civilizations. There are no two civilizations. There's only one civilization. That civilization is actually, really, the Islamic civilization, because modern civilization is premised not really on the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in reality, it's actually premised on the Islamic civilization. That is the long and short of it. Because the Judeo-Christian civilization is what brought to the world the Dark Ages. I don't know if you remember that. The Enlightenment happened with the separation of church and state because it was a necessity. Because the priests were meddling in everything that had nothing to do with them, really. And held a stronghold over free thought. Never mind free speech, even free thought. The ability to look into the world scientifically. So, and Islam has not had that problem. Islam has never had that problem. Islam still does not have that problem. And so the point is that a lot of the freedom that is currently being experienced in the West now, historically was brought to the West, in fact, by Islam. Because Muslim scholars have always been free, historically, to engage in whatever they want to, and study whatever they want to, and reason whichever way they want to. And so that has always been the case. There's never been a conflict between reason and faith. There's never been a problem with questioning. There's never been a problem with skepticism in the Islamic tradition. Now, granted, in this modern era, where we do have some Muslims in certain quarters who do have a attitude that is counterintuitive and counterproductive, we find that this is actually more a modern phenomena that relates to a completely different discourse. It's not rooted at all in Islam in reality. Okay, it's a mixture of various things and people trying to hold on to an identity which they think is an Islamic identity. And that is something for a different discussion. So I hope this was helpful. And yeah, let me know what you think. Yeah, I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.